Today we're going to be looking at parts of speech in poetry. I came up with the idea for this video in my last video, my poetry unhaul, where I was looking at every single book of poetry that I owned, deciding whether I wanted to keep it or get rid of it. And this book, Undersleep by Daniel Hall, I had written in far too much in college, and now I never really want to read it anymore because it's just too marked up to even read. And I decided to mark it up even further with highlighters, highlighting the different parts of speech and just kind of seeing, what came up for me in that exercise. I also have to say quickly that I do have a Patreon, and I just posted a patrons only video over there called How Diverse Is My Bookshelf, where I looked at this bookshelf in terms of diversity, and it was honestly not that pretty, but if you want to see the details of that, it is on my Patreon. And if you're a poet and you want feedback on your poetry, you can subscribe there at the highest tier, and you can send me a poem a month for feedback. Right away, before I get started, I do have some caveats. I got out my highlighters today. First of all, I realized I only had 4 different colors, and there are more than 4 different parts of speech. So then I decided, obviously I'm just going to focus mostly on adjectives, nouns, and verbs. But even doing that, I was really getting flashbacks to I think I was in 5th grade when we did the parts of speech unit, diagramming sentences and all that. And I've always liked reading and writing. I was always a pretty decent writer. I always had a pretty innate understanding of what sounds grammatical, but I've never actually been that good at the parts of speech side of things, not just knowing that something is grammatically incorrect, but understanding exactly why and being able to articulate that was honestly actually never really my strong suit. Because of course there are words, lots of words in the English language that, can be multiple different parts of speech depending on how they're used. And so anyways, I'm just saying I'm not 100% confident. I may have gotten a couple of these wrong, and you are more than welcome to correct me in the comments if I did. But I still think it was a totally worthwhile exercise, and I do have some things to say about poetry based on this exercise. And I would also totally encourage you to do this yourself, especially if you are a writer. You may or may not have a book that you're willing to totally destroy like I did, but maybe if you have access to a photocopier, you can photocopy some poems that you really, really like. And you definitely should do this with your own work, and I would really recommend maybe doing both, looking at some poets you really, really like, and then looking at your own poems and seeing what are these poets doing, what are you doing, should you be doing anything differently, etc. So one thing that I notice a lot with sort of beginner poets is an overuse of adjectives or an over-reliance on adjectives. And so I'm just going to kind of demonstrate that through one of the poems in this collection, which does not overuse adjectives at all. This is called Walking to Another Landscape. And again, I highlighted adjectives, nouns, and verbs. Adjectives are yellow, nouns are orange, and verbs are pink. I did have one other color, blue, which in this case I started to highlight prepositions, but then I kind of even gave up on that. So you can kind of ignore the blue. Just focus on the pink verbs, yellow adjectives, and orange nouns. I'm not going to read the whole poem. There's just this one part I really thought was interesting in terms of parts of speech, and it goes: across the fields, bonfires snap their flags as heaps of stalks go up in smoky flames, high and wild. The men who tend them, talking through the night, a dialect I'll never know, of a tongue I'll never master. So one of the benefits of this exercise, first of all, is that it kind of separates the different parts of speech so that you can look at, in your own poetry, all of the verbs at once, all of the nouns at once, all of the adjectives at once, which is kind of interesting. Here we've got the verbs snap, go, tend, talking, know, master. So if this was your own writing, you could ask, are these the best possible verbs? What's going on with your verb choices? But I really want to talk about nouns and adjectives here, because this is a very descriptive sensory passage, right? But it doesn't actually use a lot of adjectives. I think a lot of poets, again, like I said, it's not a hard and fast rule, but I think a lot of beginner poets kind of overuse adjectives. But here we've got smoky, high, and wild. And wild is a really interesting one. One of the other problems with adjectives that people run into a lot is using adjectives that are just not that interesting, that are basically implied by the noun. And often, in my opinion, it's better to choose just a really specific noun versus a noun paired with one or more adjectives, right? Like think about the difference between saying like a tall green tree versus saying a sycamore, which is a more specific type of tree where tall and green are kind of implied by the noun. And also searching for those specific nouns, I find the words themselves are often more fun and interesting, like they have a more interesting sound to them. And also, we all have sort of different ideas of adjectives. Like wild here is, I think, a well-used adjective, but you and I might have very different things that come to mind when we think of wild. But we probably don't have as different of a conceptual landscape when we think of a noun like flag. So I think you have a bit more sort of like authorial control of what is popping up in your reader's mind when you just use lots of specific nouns instead of adjectives, which are a little bit more open-ended. So the nouns here, tons of nouns: fields, bonfires, flags, heaps, stalks, flames, men, night, dialect, tongue. And also the adjectives kind of come later. There's not, syntactically, in terms of the sentence structure, the focus is not on the adjectives, right? They don't even appear until like 3 lines down. Across the fields, bonfires snap their flags as heaps of stalks go up in smoky flames. We don't even get to smoky until later. Smoky flames, high and wild. So syntactically, like high and wild come after the comma. They're sort of like an aside. They're not the focus. The focus is on all these beautiful specific nouns. Here's a different poem I'm going to read in full just to show you just how noun-heavy poetry can be. This is called Properties, and it's made up of several haikus that are also named with like subtitles that are italicized. Okay. Change. The jar's mouth is packed, transactions beyond number, but the sum exact. Glasses. Where the daylight stings, these take in the world, blindly clarifying things. Bookmark. Train ticket instead, sufficient unto the day, the chapter unread. Dresser. The struggle between wash and wear is done. At last, everything is clean. Vial. Eyedropper, a bird's beak that dripped absolution, asleep beyond words. So there are not that many adjectives in this, right? Packed, exact, sufficient, unread, done, clean. And there are not that many verbs. Is, stings, take, clarifying, is, dripped. A lot of is. And so I want to talk about that more in this next poem, how punctuation can replace verbs, and especially can replace and serve in place of passive verbs, like to be verbs. This is called A Winter Apple. Grateful, I took an apple from its paper, took it in both hands, raised it to my lips, inhaling its myth of open air and closure. Then a desire to swallow space and time, or to follow them backward and forward, endlessly up and down the macadam, end over end, back to seed or on to cider. Not so fast, I pleaded, the heft of it, the chill sweetness. Apples in winter are a bitter gift. I set it down again, entire. Okay, so I skipped some of the words in this. I didn't highlight all of them, but focusing mostly on the nouns, adjectives, and verbs that I did highlight. So you can see here how some verbs are just missing. Like, then a desire to swallow space and time. He doesn't say, then I felt a desire to swallow space and time. He just skips it. And that's something that you can do, well, in writing in general, but I think a lot in poetry. And because of that, when you choose to include one of those words, one of those verbs that you could have implied, I think it's interesting. It draws my attention. It makes me wonder, why here? Why now have you included the verb? So, for example, in this poem, towards the end, he writes, apples in winter are a bitter gift. Instead of saying, for example, like apples in winter, comma, or colon, or dash, a bitter gift, right? It just kind of draws my eye. I think it works well here towards the end of the poem to maybe be a little less concise and, take the time to include that verb. I mean, I don't know why you would or wouldn't in a particular spot, but it's something that I noticed because, again, like you could just kind of cut like all the verbs if you wanted and just replace them with punctuation. So when a poet does that, it interests me, and when a poet opts not to do that, it interests me, and I think they both have, they both have their place, and it's just kind of something to think about in your own writing. Another choice that you have in your writing that I think this exercise really highlights is that lots of words can be different parts of speech. You can use different forms, like you can use the noun form or the adjective form, and how does it read differently? What is the effect of those choices is a question you could ask yourself about your own writing. Like here, again, there's a lot of nouns, not so many adjectives, at the end where he writes, the heft of it, the chill sweetness, apples in winter are a bitter gift. So the chill sweetness, he doesn't say they're chill and sweet. And really the emphasis is on heft, another noun, as opposed to saying hefty. He could have said the apples were hefty, chill, and sweet, but instead he says the heft of it, the chill sweetness. You know, it sounds different. At the end of the day, I don't even really have an elaborate explanation as to why you would do one or the other, but I think it's important to note that you can. And really, when I think of an apple, I think sweet would probably be the first thing that I think of, not so much chill, not so much heft. And so it's interesting that he starts with heft. I think, you know, the noun that you place first is going to get a bit more of your reader's attention. So I would think of it this way: as a writer, you know, you're really steering your reader's attention with these choices of what comes first, with these choices of what is a noun and what are you using, you know, the adjective form of instead. And really, just speaking for myself anyway, as a reader, I want my attention steered in an unexpected place. Otherwise, why would I read a poem about an apple when I could just like eat an apple? I could just encounter an apple and have like the standard apple experience instead of, you know, Daniel Hall's apple experience that he wants you to have. You know what I mean? Another benefit of this exercise is that it can show you syntactical repetition in a way that's more clear. Like you can just kind of see it, right, happening on the page. So here's another poem. It's called The New World. Months of drought. I'd been killing an hour at the end of the century reading a book I'd read before when it began. This subliminal hush, as close as the pressure of my own blood, the very voice of tenderness, of comfort, inrushing like cinnamon or flannel, or the circle he retraced above my heart. Over and over as the fever lifted me and let me fall. Then, like a door hissing shut, the rain stopped. Crickets rang. Minutes had passed. The stars were out. Okay, so you can like feel the rhythm slowing and solidifying and getting more repetitive at the end, but when you actually get out your highlighters and highlight the different parts of speech, you can really see it on the page and you can see specifically, okay, what's happening. It's not just repetitive. It's not just, you know, this regular rhythm of short sentences. It's specifically noun, verb, noun, verb, noun, verb, right? And you can like see that so clearly through this exercise. And finally, here's the last poem I'm going to read. It's another example of, again, how you can kind of cut verbs and especially passive verbs. It's part of a longer poem, but this section is called History 101. History 101. Bearing its burden of tininess, lightly, a red mite made its sad way across my open book, verso to recto. Sad for it because annoying, somehow, to me, though why, its size or color or doggedness, I couldn't have said. One swipe of my thumb, though, and it was over. Not a crumb of creature remained, just an elegant line, perfectly drawn, in exactly the same shade of red. Okay, it's important to note here that this is one of the poems where I was like, I should use the blue highlighter, and I tried highlighting adverbs. So that's what I'm trying to do here. So like I said, something I noticed with this in particular is the verbs that are implied, that are not stated, and also like the subjects that are implied. So sad for it because annoying. You can understand that what he means is something like, I felt sad for it, or I was sad for it, but he cuts the I, cuts the was or felt, and just gets kind of straight to it, which I think works well here because it's clear. But I would also say, you know, there's times where I see poets using verbs that they could just cut and it would be somewhat more interesting because, you know, those basic verbs are just, as words, they're not that interesting. And, you know, for a poem, I think it's not just about being concise, it's about having every word kind of be punchy and interesting and sound nice. And I think if you cut some of the boring verbs, it's more likely to do that. So sometimes I see people missing an opportunity to do that. I also see people cutting verbs and cutting subjects when it is unclear, totally unclear, like, and you actually could use a subject and could use a verb. Here, you know, there's the speaker and there's the might, and it's obviously probably not the might that's feeling sad, so, you know, it's clear. But if you've got a bunch of different, you know, characters in a poem, you might want to specify who it is that's doing what. And again, I just can't help but notice places where an adjective form of a word is skipped over in favor of a noun form, you know, bearing its burden of tininess. is kind of a more interesting way of saying that the mite is tiny. It's not just tiny, it's bearing its burden of tininess, which, you know, says something. It has some more meaning to it about, I don't know, the delicacy and vulnerability of this bug that does, you know, ultimately get crushed and killed, which is kind of the point of the poem, right? So that's all for my parts of speech lesson. How did I do? Did you catch any that were wrong? There were certainly some that were missing that I was just like, I'm just gonna leave it blank. I'm not really sure what part of speech that is. So again, I totally challenge you and encourage you to do this, and I would love to hear about it in the comments if you do. I would recommend doing it with, you know, a poet you like and whose work you respect, and with your own work if you're a poet. You know, see side by side what's going on. What are your habits? What are their habits? Are your habits ideal? Are they conscious? Have you thought about them? And, you know, if nothing else, as a refresher of elementary school grammar lessons that I personally haven't really thought about in a very, very long time. And again, please consider joining my Patreon, subscribing, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I don't think I've ever mentioned that on the channel before, but I do have those things, right? Because we are all legally obligated to have those things, especially if you are a writer. That's all for now. Thank you for watching.